Hi, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. It was an absolutely unbelievable day at trial today in the Delphi murders case. I would say it is probably the most important day of the entire trial. Tomorrow will also be extremely important. It's the moment we have all been waiting for. I've talked over and over about the confessions and about how much they're going to matter and how whether or not the state can bring that information is going to make the difference for the Richard Allen trial. Now, I've said from the beginning that whether or not he confessed 61 times or maybe less than that, the state initially said 61 times, to the crime of abducting Libby German and Abigail Williams from the Monon High Bridge on February 13th, 2017. This is what he's accused of: brutally murdering them and leaving their bodies in the woods. One of them, no clothing at all. Is the state going to successfully be able to bring 61 or something like that confessions to the jury? That's all important because, frankly, the evidence against Richard Allen is very thin. They do not have a lot. These confessions are extremely important. Are they going to be the key to finally solving the 7-year-old mystery? Because for 7 years, we have not had anyone held responsible for an absolutely brutal murder of a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old. So is it true that Richard Allen actually knew details and facts about the murder scene that only the killer would know? Is that true? And then was he driven to this point by such extreme pressure and deprivation as the state held him in solitary confinement, much of that time on health watch for more than a year, even though he is presumed innocent? Is that something that makes all of these confessions null and void? Were they all coerced because he was held in this brutal solitary confinement for far longer than is recommended? Well, today at trial, we covered all of that. It was an extremely long day. We went all the way to 6:30, which is why the live stream is getting started so late. I have over 60 pages of notes, much of which would be incomprehensible to anyone. I mean, here, let me see if I can. I've got to get over here. Yeah, just to give you an example. And I never want to waste your time. I really try before I get started to go through my notes and highlight the stuff that's most important. And, almost overshadowed by the confessions is a very important morning that we spent this morning when we heard the original interviews of Richard Allen. They were eye-popping because the way he approached it, what he said, was so important. I think it was important to see those two things right together. And frankly, I think it really helped the defense. I am going to go into all of that. I'm just going to take us through the day kind of as it happened. You know what? I messed up. I didn't find out who my first 5 were. Let's go back. Buckwheat, Idaho Spud Girl, Julie Farrell, Minanya, and Spence Marcel. Welcome as the first 5 in the chat. I'm glad to have all of you tonight. Today was incredible. I mean, absolutely incredible. It's really the day that we have been waiting for. This is the moment when everything sort of comes into focus and we boil down to the real point here, which is Richard Allen responsible for these murders? Everything up until now has led up to the moment in time when the jury is really faced and confronted with that question. Did he do it? Is he the guy? And has the state proven it? So let's get started. I really was really surprised and very struck by those interviews. These were the interviews, not the original one. We'd already heard about that. The original one he did within a couple of weeks of the time that the girls disappeared. Less than that. I think it was on the 18th and they disappeared on the 13th. Their bodies were found on the 14th. So he had gone voluntarily to the police on the 16th and said, here I am. And I was in the park. You had asked for anyone who was in the park to show up. So here I am. Then on the 18th, he just gave his information. On the 18th, they actually took him and interviewed him in a store parking lot. We'll cover all of that. And they asked him questions and he gave them the information. That file marked cleared, was marked as if, Richard Allen is no longer responsible. So let's hop into what happened today. We started out with the interview that happened on October 13th of 2022. At that point, Richard Allen, they made very clear, was not under arrest. He could leave any time. And now they said, we're going to read you your rights. There was kind of laughter, like that was a joke. That was not a joke. They were really looking to possibly arrest him. There was a Miranda warning. This is October 13th. They did not make the same warning at his next interview, and that became very controversial. We've heard about that already. The defense thinks that invalidates anything he said in the interview, although frankly, I see nothing negative that he said in the interview. So I did figure out one question I had earlier. You remember how Richard Allen's file was under Richard Allen Whiteman? And the suggestion almost by the prosecution was, well, was he hiding it? Why would he have given that name? Why was it filed like this? And there was never an answer one way or the other. So it wasn't fully damning to Richard Allen, but it was kind of confusing. Well, it turns out he lives on a road called Whiteman Drive. So that explains. And I'm sure whoever took this note down just wrote Richard Allen and they saw the roads written there and they thought, well, that's the same thing. We also found out that in this very first interview, and let me be really clear because I don't want to jump too far ahead and not explain stuff. So these interviews that I'm talking about are now 5 years after he was originally interrogated within 5-6 days of the time of the murders. What's happened is they have spotted his file. They found it filed in a desk drawer, kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark style. Like, oh, look, here is this one folder that for some reason we did nothing with. They pull it out and they decide they'd better talk to him again and maybe he could be the killer because he was in the park at the time of the murders. So they interview him, not just once, but twice. First on the 13th of October and then again on the 26th of October. But the year is 2022, 5 years after the original murders of Abby and Libby. So at this point, he's read his Miranda rights, but it's not something that he certainly has no idea from the way it sort of plays out. He has no idea that he's considered a suspect, although he is about to learn that. He also voluntarily gives them that email, Foojack, and now we have it, Foojack A, may have been Zebro, at gmail.com. But that's what we had talked yesterday at the end of the day about how they wanted to put in some information, some searches that came from that Gmail account. And they were saying that they were of a sexual nature. That's being debated. The prosecution submitted something, the defense submitted something, and the judge is going to rule on that at some point. But what we found out was he didn't hide that email. It isn't a secret email that he had taken with, that he had somehow managed to conceal from the prosecution until recently. He mentioned it all the way back during this interview in 2022. He mentioned right up front in the interview that he'd had health trouble, a heart attack, a couple of stents, depression, anxiety, high blood pressure, and cholesterol. The depression and anxiety are particularly important because the statement by Richard Allen's team is they believe this depression and anxiety became something used against Richard Allen, that the prosecution took that and figured out a way to essentially torture him by this more than a year-long confinement in private isolation, that they put him in that situation knowing he would be unable to stand it. He in fact broke, he confessed to crimes he didn't commit. That's the defense position. So he talked about how he had been at one point the store manager of a Walmart and then had gone to CVS where he had been since 2013. The day that the girls went missing, the 13th of February, he went to his parents' house in Mexico, not the country, but Mexico, Indiana. He said he thought somewhere around then his mom was having hip surgery. He couldn't remember for sure. He went home. It was fairly warm. He put on a jacket and went to the trails. We'd had a question a couple nights ago. Well, what about those trails? Had he done them before? Was he new to this? And the answer was he'd done them probably many times before. He said they usually usually when we go, we'd walk to the high bridge. So he left about 11 to 11:15 and was there by noon, walked down to the high bridge, walked out a little way and watched the fish, sat on a bench that overlooks it for a few minutes, and then walked back and out. The timing is all important here. Although it is a little tough 5 years after to pin everything on whether or not someone got the exact time they went somewhere correct, the prosecution says, well, that's not the same time you told us before. Before, you told us you were there between either initially you started 1 to 3 and then you changed it to 1:30 to 3:30. And now you're saying 12 to 1:30, which would mean he was gone from the park before the girls were ever abducted and before they were murdered. Now, how do we know when the girls were abducted? Because Libby actually filmed it on her camera. And we have a small, tiny clip of a video, 43 seconds, that shows a guy walking toward them. Prosecution says, that looks like you, Richard Allen. A guy walking right behind Abby, and someone, could be the person walking behind Abby, could be someone else, ordering the girls down the hill. So, let's see. I'm trying to cut so that we can have it as short as possible because I don't want to waste your time. All right. Did you go often? He said not often. We went maybe once a month or maybe even 2 times a week during the nice weather, but maybe a time or 2 in the winter, and that's when they went. Now, I did think it was really funny as a note. I mean, he's lived there for many years. He'd also lived in other places in Indiana, but he didn't know the name of any of the streets. I was always like that growing up. You know, you just, go down to the A&P and just go down the A&P and turn left and you go here, and it's places as opposed to the name of the street. So he was always like, this place. He never knew the name of the street. So when he sort of described how he came to go to the police, and it started out with, they asked anyone who was there in the park that day when the girls were missing, when they were abducted, if you were there, come in and talk. He said, I told my wife, and she said, well, they want to talk to everybody. So he went to the sheriff's station and voluntarily put his name and information down. So a couple of days later, Officer Doolin calls him, and at the time, Richard Allen is in his car. He pulls over and Officer Doolin asks if he can come down or maybe meet somewhere. So he was headed on his way, Richard was, to the Save-A-Lot grocery store. He said, I pulled in there and we talked. I gave him the account. He said, it's been years and I've thought about it a lot. He later would say, though, that he hadn't thought about it much since then. Probably both were true in their own way. He said, I think it was about noon, a little before or after, and then that he left 1:30, 1:45. He talked about seeing the 3 girls walking the trail. Now, it's important to remember that the 3 girls walking the trail, it was actually 4, and it's always very confusing why everyone talks about 3, but there were 4 girls, and then there were 2 girls, Libby and Abby, who were abducted and murdered. The 3 girls simply were witnesses seeing somebody along the path. And at least 2 of them have testified and said, we remember seeing a guy, and we think the guy we saw was Bridge Guy, even though they did have very different ideas of what the person looked like. But these 3 girls were watching the trail, and he said one seemed to be watching the others. One seemed a lot older than the others, maybe an older sister, because he said they kind of looked like sisters. And in fact, of the 4 girls, 3 were sisters. One was just a friend. And he said, so other than those 3 girls, he said he didn't see anyone in the park. So he sat on a bench overlooking the creek, and there were 2 vehicles down there. Let me stop there. So he sat looking over the creek, and that's where he was at the time that the 3 girls walked by, and he saw them. 3/4 girls. There was a long discussion that was almost impenetrable about where he parked, and there was no final answer. I gathered sometimes he parked one place, sometimes he parked another, so it was difficult for him to say, this is where I parked that particular day. But in any event, it wasn't totally clear. One possibility was that he parked at the old Mears the old Mears entry, which is the same entry that Abby and Libby were dropped off at. He said that at points in time, they would post signs that say, please don't park here. And at points in time, those signs weren't up. So when the signs weren't up and the gate was open, you went in. If the gate was closed and the signs were up, you didn't go in. So that's what he was saying. He wasn't clear on where exactly he parked. But one thing I did think about, if in fact he parked at the Mears entrance, the prosecution is relying on the fact that his car was shown, well, they say it's his car, the defense has argued about it, shown at 1:26 p.m. going past the Hoosier Harvest store that's a little bit further along than the Mears. I always need a map to kind of show y'all. I will pop up my map here so I can talk you through it, because it's too hard to explain, I think, without. Let's see about that. Okay, do you see where the Mears entrance is? It's in red, and you see the Mears farm right above it. And it's all running along a road called 300 North right there. The Mears entrance is just south of the road. The Mears farm is right across from it, north of the road. So he's saying that he parked, maybe parked at the Mears entrance. It wasn't clear, but if he did, then the camera, the Hoosier Harvest Store camera, is a little bit to the left. So if in fact the prosecution is relying on the fact that he would not have been coming from the right side of your screen to the left side of your screen, which would be west, he wouldn't have been coming that way after he went to the park, because he'd be going home. His home was further to the left over there in Delphi. And so he wouldn't have been going left basically on that road, and not going west. He would have been going the other direction. But if he parked at the Mears entrance, then it's possible that he actually would have been passing by that camera right when he said he would, on his way leaving the park. So I don't know if the defense is planning to argue that or not, but I would presume that is something they're going to argue. And it was left very vague. During his original interview, he said he had parked at the old Farm Bureau building, and no one could figure out what that was. There wasn't an old Farm Bureau building. So it was assumed, well, maybe that was the old Child Protective Services building. It's an old building, so maybe it would be the same. In any event, I felt like, from the standpoint of someone sitting in the audience who didn't have the benefit of, the paper that they were pointing to, I felt like it was really unclear. And I don't know whether the jury will be able to kind of figure that out. So he said that he figured there were maybe 8 to 10 platforms total across the bridge. We were told it was really 6. Platforms went out from either side. It was a train trestle. So terrifying though this is, I assume the reason they had these trestles were if a train was coming while you were out on the bridge, you had somewhere to stand kind of off to the side. So there you have it. That's a really terrifying thought. It's 60 feet above the water, and there are no rails or anything on the old bridge. It's kind of a scary spot. He said that they had, all right, that's more parking. The car he drove in 2017 was the black car, the very one they found on the Hoosier Harvest Store video, headed west. He said he didn't interact with the girls. If he saw anyone else, it didn't click to him. He did mention being on his phone, looking at the stock market ticker. He said he had an individually traded account. He said, I did terribly for a while and I don't do it anymore. It was just a hobby for him. He talked about what he was wearing. Carhartt jacket. Back then it would have been black, he figured. Blue jeans, probably not boots, or maybe boots. He wasn't really clear. And a hat, a small hat. And then either the boots or maybe old tennis shoes, he said. And of course, that could describe what Bridge Guy is wearing. And they're going to confront him with that in just a minute. So in this interview, they tell him, we would like to examine your phone. We can extract data and tell where someone's at, is what they told him. How long are you going to have my phone? I'm trying to do some kind of quotes around here. Did you take data and move it? They asked. He said, I have no idea. And they don't ever answer how long they're going to have his phone. And they asked him about when he got a new phone. He said, they come back to it over and over. We can start with this phone and extract data from that.
So they read him about the right to refuse and how he can go talk to a lawyer first. And then they're saying, we need your passcode. And so then he says, well, wait a minute. It's sounding, he gives it to them. And he says, wait, it's starting to sound more like, he said, I'm not going to be somebody's fall guy. He said, everyone we talk to, the law enforcement tells him, everyone we're talking to, we're just trying to eliminate them, which is really, I mean, I guess in a sense true, but they're not talking to anyone except Richard Allen right now. They're pretty much at a standstill on the source of where exactly these murders came from. They don't have anybody else that they're going after right now. And Richard Allen says, I get that. You know, they say, we just want to eliminate people. He says, okay, yeah, I get that. I mean, it's been so long. I mean, I haven't thought about it. I don't want to be somebody's fall guy. Don't think I'm questioning your integrity. And they say, also, we want to look at your car and house. It's all very important, this case. And at that point, he's like, no, get a warrant. He said, I'm starting to feel more like you're looking at me. And law enforcement says, well, we're just talking to everybody out there that day. There's no fall guy, which is false. And he says, well, if you think I've actually done this, if you want to get a warrant, I mean, I don't mind you looking at my phone, but I'm not going to have police out to my house. News leaks. I don't need that. They say, so we can look at your phone, sure, and your other phone, I'll see if I can find it. And he's about to take that back. Do you have any questions? He said, let me talk to my wife before I do anything. We watch TV shows, and I don't want to be associated with this. I'm not sure exactly what that meant, but he did mention watching Dateline, I think is what he mentioned. And an angel of he said, am I an angel of a person? No, but I don't want you looking at every website I've ever visited. And he takes his phone back at that point. He says, I wasn't out there until 3:30 or so. 1:30 was more the time I would have left. He thinks he left he left his parents' house at about 11 because they were going to do lunch and he wasn't going to go with them. And then he specifically said, at least I got this in my notes. I talked to someone else who didn't get exactly this. It was one of those days where not everybody got the exact same thing. This was going really fast. And one of the problems for the jury is going to be, and it's just the way it is, what people will have heard is different. One person will have heard one thing, one person will have heard another, and they won't get a firm answer on that. There will be disagreement among them as to exactly what was said in some of these things. But I thought I heard him say at this point, the farmer's pull-off was where I was. His Mears Farm, the Mears Farm entrance, what we've been calling that, he called the farmer's pull-off. And it was directly across from the farm. But that appeared to be what he was talking about. He said, look, I'm not going to turn into that guy, become the target. We watch Dateline. So there you go, Deborah. Deborah from Dateline is here. So law enforcement said that they wanted to search the house and the car to know for sure. He said, I had zero to do with it. I haven't been involved with this investigation. I don't want to be any more involved than I have to be. If I thought I had anything to give you, I would. Law enforcement says, well, we want to look at your car. When we do something like this, or when somebody does something like this, there could be traces of biologic information or substances left behind. We can say we looked at Rick. We looked at his car. In other words, that we cleared him. And Richard Allen says, I'm going to talk to my wife before I do anything. And law enforcement steps out. And at each of these points, I tried to really watch his body language. The court had the way it was played was they would play the entire tape. So if law enforcement stepped out for 5 minutes to kind of let him think about things, they would just play the tape for 5 minutes of him sitting there. He didn't do anything crazy. You see some of these ones where somebody does something crazy, they begin doing yoga or something. None of that. Mostly he sat there completely stoically. Just really, he seemed, at least at first, just really relaxed. He did not seem like somebody who was terrified that he was about to have a murder, double murder, pinned on him. That just didn't seem like it was happening. So, and here his arms weren't crossed. He looks at his phone some, because remember, he still had his phone at this time. So he just didn't look particularly worried. And I drew a couple of pictures for you. Pictures. that would be grandiose. These are not really pictures, but I wanted you to kind of see one of the things. I did a fair amount of work with body language around doing mediations as part of my law practice to help people figure out how to resolve cases without having to go to trial. And one issue is where people sit. So I kind of drew this up, like when they first did this is how they sat, with Richard Allen on this side and Liggett, the sheriff, sheriff. Yeah, he was the sheriff by then, and Mullen on the other side, opposite each other. That's lines of confrontation run across the table. So when they wanted to talk to him, look, they came back in, and Mullen sits right by, I never can do right, left. Okay, Mullen sits right by Richard Allen. Going to go, oh, there we go. Sits right by him. And so as a result, it's more of a cooperation, working together. And they did that several times. I thought it was always really interesting when they would do that. I just throw that in there because it struck me. So he says, it's not me, but if it's taken, they come in and they show him the picture of Bridge Guy. And he says, it's not me. They say, is that you? It's not me. But if it's taken with their phone, there's no way it could be me. I've never met them. Now, the prosecution used this as more or less kind of a confession, at least something negative that Richard Allen was saying. Wow, I don't see that at all in that. I thought that was pretty clear. It's not me, but if it's taken with their phone, there's no way it could be me because I've never met them. And he said that they talked to him about his psychiatric diagnosis of depression and an attempt he had made perhaps where he was threatening himself at some point. And he said, well, that's nothing new. And I was going to off myself that night, and you've obviously talked to my wife. So he begins to realize they've talked to his wife. They say, well, you were wearing the same clothing as Bridge Guy. And he's like, blue jeans are perfectly common. And he even argues that it was not even a Carhartt jacket. He said, do you want me to say that's my car? Law enforcement says, that is your car. There's no doubt of it. He said, well, we went to your house this morning and you rode in a car with us. And by now, Richard Allen is really agitated and his arms are crossed. And they say, you're not a mean fellow. You wouldn't go out and do something malicious. So why is this information, law enforcement asked, showing us one thing and you were telling us another? And Richard Allen says, things seem to have taken a turn, which is definitely true. He said, until you have something on me and arrest me, I'm not real concerned here, but it feels more like I've been interrogated. You're saying you've already talked to my wife and daughter. I'm not hiding anything. I told you I was out there. And they say, we have more questions. Richard Allen says, I think we're done. I'm going to skip a little bit. He says, it's not me, because he repeatedly did say, I didn't do it. It's not me. You're not going to make me believe it's me, trying to lure me into telling you I killed somebody, and I'm not going to do it. He said, arrest me, take me home. Arrest me or take me home. I'm done. So I'm trying to give you as much of a flavor so you can feel like you were actually there watching it. This is not public. So it's not like you can go look this one up on the internet. One day it will be, but for now, I'm just trying to make you feel kind of like you hit the highlights of actually seeing it. He said, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Arrest me or let me go. Now you piss me off. Are you arresting me? Am I free to go? They say you were always free to go. He says, you're an a-hole. Heads out. And there was actual laughter in the courtroom at that point. I am going to kind of tell you how I felt watching this interview. It made me get on Richard Allen's side somewhat. It just felt like they were so attacking him. And it seemed to me the way he was acting is the way someone would act who was innocent and was being accused of this. And he told them over and over, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. And they just kept asking the same question again and again and again. And we're going to see that even more moving into the next interview. These were really, to me, So telling. This is hearing from Richard Allen in the middle of the trial. I cannot imagine that they would put him on the stand. That would be nuts. I don't think they will do that, but they don't have to. Richard Allen testified right here. This video shows him explaining that he didn't do it. It's perfect because he doesn't ever get cross-examined. So I think they will rely on this, and that will be all that we'll hear from him. This is the most we will probably ever hear from Richard Allen about the murders and about what he has to say. So that's why it's so critically important. Now, I have just tons and tons of people tonight, so let me stop for just a minute and do that. Old Lady Bakes and Amanda Knight are both new members. Welcome, welcome. And Megan, thank you for the super chat. And she wants to know about how the families seem to be absorbing this and whether I feel the state's case has been weak. It almost feels like it's been the defense case most of the time. So I think as far as the families, I mentioned yesterday how difficult that testimony about the blood spatter was for the families and for Libby's mother. It was just terrible. And I do think Abby's mother was sitting in a spot where hopefully she couldn't see the pictures, but anyway, it was very brutal. Today, it was very difficult for Richard Allen's wife, and she cried through a good deal of it. I'm going to tell you when that happens, what I saw in the courtroom, and how some of the a particular juror reacted. So I'm going to take you through that. I do think that I feel like the state's case has been so far fairly weak legally. Yes. And that's really why I came, because I was concerned about that. I was concerned based on what we were seeing and the exclusion of all of Richard Allen's evidence, that it seemed like it was setting up to be an unfair battle with very little evidence against him. And that's what I wanted to see for myself and wanted to report on to you. As far as the question, though, about whether it's been a defense case most of the time, that is really in the eyes of the jury. And typically juries tend to really believe the prosecution. So while I think from a legal standpoint, it's easy to stand outside and say this is weak and that's weak, I think that sometimes that is not the way the jury necessarily sees it. So typically, I think they would look at the pictures and the crime and the assumption that they will have. You can say it as many times as you want. They do not presume the person is innocent. They presume the state is right. That is just a fact. And so all of those things kind of put together, I think, mean it's likely that they would normally be leaning toward the state. In this particular case, the defense has done a good job at poking holes. So I don't think it's one-sided. I think that that's more of a legal perspective than it is necessarily a jury perspective. Cheryl gifted 5 lawyerly memberships. Thank you, Cheryl. And Gia, thank you very much for the super chat. 2 more new members. Be sure to turn on the ability to receive memberships. Mama Pinks and Marlon will tell you how to do that. Anyone, and 17K Boyce are both new members. Kimmer K, thank you so much for the super sticker. And Italian Pam Lee. And friend of St. Frank, I appreciate the traveling fund. It's been quite the experience. Thank you very much. Anyone? Yes, I'm so glad you're a member of the community too. Thank you for joining. We're going to be having a members only event this weekend. In fact, it'll be probably Saturday night after the live stream. We'll have something. It'll be online. You'll have a link you can go to. Member since day one. Wow, Rexine, that is impressive. That is really impressive. I'm glad to have you along. That's wonderful. Shannon Jacobs, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And Axum Outdoor Adventures. I'm so glad y'all are enjoying the coverage. I really am, because to me, this is such a fascinating case, and it's really important because of some of the issues, the difficult issues around the fair trial, but the desire so much for justice as applied to the victim. So I realize how hard this case is. So I'm so grateful that y'all are really enjoying this coverage. Michael, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate that. And Gretchenaro, thank you for the super sticker. Becky, thank you. All right, we'll stop there. But I really appreciate all that. And I've got some more people to thank, but I will get to that in just a minute. So let's dive back in. So I want to take you to the second interview. Now, by this time, they've searched his house. They've searched his car. They've seized a lot of his things. They have his phone. So things are definitely moving along and in a bad direction for Richard Allen. So it was an interview on October 26, 2022, just about 13 days after the one I told you about just a minute ago. And I did a little drawing of kind of trying to tell you, I'll be like, oh yes, Lee should definitely be a medical illustrator or something with these drawings. Okay, so this is how, no, this way. This is how he was sitting at the desk. See how his arms were pretty relaxed, but he had his leg crossed over him, which can be a, get back sort of a signal. And so it was not relaxed like it was before, where he just sat there like this. Now he's got his leg crossed and he, clearly is holding everybody at a distance. And he grabbed both of his legs. That's sort of a protection. He definitely was giving off vibes that he was more uncomfortable. They asked him about knives and his gun. Did you have those with you on February 13th? He said, I didn't. I just went for a walk. He said, we'll get to the meat and potatoes of this, Rick. Handguns are very specific as far as characteristics of guns. They're like fingerprints. Now, we do know from the testimony of the ballistics expert, that's not true. And that's why the questions that were asked around with the Holman, who introduced these, as well as with the ballistics expert, that's way too strong. In fact, if they had been allowed the defense to put in their expert, one of their experts would have said the whole thing is hokum, nonsense. And I just know from being in the legal community, that's a real argument. There are real questions about whether or not the whole concept that you can match a bullet to a specific machine-made product of a gun, that's really not very likely. You probably can't. But he's being told we match them like fingerprints. The prosecutor and the other investigators, they want to lock you up and throw away the key. I'm on your side. And Richard Allen says it doesn't matter. It's over. And they talked to him about, what do you mean by that? And he says, what I mean is the damage is done. There's no backing out of it. The neighbors, he keeps worrying about the neighbors. And the neighbors, he says, have seen the police there. The neighbors have seen the car seized. How is he ever going to outlive this? And they push harder. It's not just the bullet. That experts say it's your voice on the video. Now, that's false. And that's one of the things that they were queried about. I think it was Holman yesterday. They said, well, isn't it true that that you didn't have an expert, but you're allowed to lie? That's one of the things. I don't know when we got into the position in this country where it's just okay for law enforcement to lie to people. That's fine. No problem. Just lie. Maybe they'll confess. Maybe they'll say something dumb because they're confused. I don't think it's okay. I don't know why we say that's okay, but that is the rule, is they can lie to you in an interrogation. I don't get it. To me, that's not who we are. But he lied. There was no expert who said it was his voice on the video. And I see, let me go ahead and answer that, because I think the very next question is Kim's, who said, did Richard's voice sound similar to Bridge Guy after hearing it? Which is a good question. I tried really hard to hear that. Some people were saying yes, some were saying no. I'm probably going to go with a no, because I didn't think his voice was as deep as Bridge Guy's, which seemed really deep. But we have that sort of computer generated sounding voice on that tape, down the hill. It just doesn't even sound real. It's very strange sounding. I don't think it sounds like that, but I'm not sure that's the original version. I think that is some kind of cleaned up, filtered out version, which may be why it sounds so weird. So I'm going with a no, but there were people around the courthouse, around the courtroom, who were saying, yeah, I think it sounds the same. So who knows? But I think it's a good question. And thanks, Kim, for your question. All right. So Richard Allen says, I don't know how my bullet would have gotten out there. There's no way. I'm telling you, there's not. And then they ask him, were you the mastermind? He's like, mastermind. Okay. That's exactly what he says. Mastermind. Okay. Like we're here. We're at mastermind. What the heck? He said, do you realize what you've done to me? You've talked to the people I work with, my neighbors. And then he says and comes back to this theme over and over. There is no way a round of my gun was anywhere near the girls, the bridge. Law enforcement, I'm trying to help you. No, you're trying to accuse me of murdering 2 little girls. I'm done. You already think I've done it. Arrest me. You already think I've done it. The damage is done. The damage doesn't just go away. Of course, I think he had no clue what was left to be in store. I think he just thought it was embarrassment of the neighbors. I don't think he had any idea what would be to come. I don't know how he could have. He says, and at this point, law enforcement tells him, I don't think you're the one that killed him. The interviewer does. He said, he says, this is Richard Allen, I could never do that. That's not who I am. Who did it? I can't tell you. You want me to make up a story? I did not murder 2 little girls. And twice they cut it right there. Now, they mentioned to the jury they were going to redact some spots, but twice it sounded like I did not murder 2 little. And you wonder, surely they weren't cutting out the word girls, because that's pretty innocuous. I don't really see why they would need to, but it almost gave you the impression, the way it got cut, that he had called them some bad word. Now, as you heard the rest of it, I don't believe that. He repeatedly called them girls or kids, and it was nothing. At no point was he inappropriate with his language about that. So I don't think so. Nonetheless, I thought that was kind of an unfortunate for the defense cut. So, and I told you about how it would go silent and we all be sitting there in the courtroom, everybody like, okay, along with Richard Allen. So it'd be 5 minutes and they'd go out to see if, I guess, he would crack or become nervous. One of the things I noticed was when we got to this silence part, there were like photographs of the bullet there and things lying there, and he didn't pick them up and study them, which I probably would have. There was a computer for the officer there. He didn't get up and look at it. He didn't do anything. He just sat there very patiently the whole time. He did look, by this interview, the second interview, very dejected with his shoulders really slumped. I tried to draw that for you, but that was just absolutely impossible. But he just looked so just like slumped over, like he was so overwhelmed by it all. He said, I'm not going to admit to this. I had nothing to do with, I'm not going to admit to something I had nothing to do with. There is nothing you have that is going to implicate me because I wasn't out there. I know that a round of my gun did not end up at a murder scene. Just bam. I know that a round of my gun did not end up in a murder scene. You aren't telling us the truth. Sorry, this is law enforcement. You aren't telling us the truth. And he said, you don't care, which is certainly the case, because over and over and over again, he told them no, 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 no. And they kept asking, as if he would confess, if only they asked one more time. He says, you better tell us, because if you don't, we're going to, okay, here's one. I heard something as perfect example. I heard something, my mouth dropped. I'm like, did he just say that? Then I round robined it with somebody else, totally different, right? So here's what I heard. You better tell us, because if you don't, we're going to make it up. I'm like, what? They said that, but I don't think that was correct. I think this is this was a better thing, because then they said something about the media. So I think this is what was said. You better tell us, because if you don't, TV is going to make you a murderer, or going to make you a monster, or going to make it up, something like that. So I think he was saying not we will, but that this will happen in the media. And that's probably pretty true, I suppose. But that's kind of an example of what the jury will have to deal with, because they're going to be back there with all these different thoughts in their head about what they just heard, because it's not always that easy to hear. And when people are talking fast, you pull out little snippets. You don't get every last word. You certainly can't get it all down in your notes. I'm a pretty fast note taker, legibly, maybe not so much, but pretty fast. Nonetheless, there's zero way you can get it all. So you then hear him say, where's this guy who's saying I helped him? If they're saying that, they're effing crazy. I'm done. If you're going to arrest me, This is ridiculous. I'm not talking anymore. I think nothing that you have is going to show me the murderer of 2 little girls. It's not possible. I didn't shoot anybody. I never even pointed a gun at anybody because I wasn't there. I was on the trails, not a murder scene, murder site, he might have said. So, I mean, super strong. And I really did feel like this was highly positive for the defense. I mean, I really felt like it was. And I think it seemed like he was being attacked with a whole very little information except the bullet. And it's going to get even more in just a minute. Let me thank a few people while I'm here. Vesper is worried that no matter what, those girls aren't going to get justice. So much about this case is left unanswered. I agree. And I felt like the testimony yesterday pointed heavily toward the concept of 2 shooters, or not shooters, 2 murderers, 2 people at least involved in the murders. And that's really terrifying because they don't have anybody else in mind. And in fact, they come in and said, no, we think it was only one, even though up until now they've been searching very possibly for more than one. Even after the arrest of Richard Allen, they were still saying, hey, investigation's still open. If you have any ideas, come to us. But it is definitely a risk. In fact, I think there's a good chance that no matter what the verdict, they're not going to have justice, because if the verdict is not guilty, no one has been arrested for the brutal murders of 2 young girls. And if someone is finally arrested, it may not, or is finally convicted, it may not be the right person, or it may not be all of the people who were involved. And any permutation of that is not enough. It's not justice if that's the case. So I'm worried about that too. Jet T. Oh, thank you. From Perth, Australia. Well, that's cool. That's cool. I'm really hoping to cover the mushroom case there when it comes around to it. Ben Sellers. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you, Ben, that praying for justice in this case is important, and it's going to be difficult. Becky has been a member for 2 months. Welcome, and I'm so glad. Valerie is a new member. Cheryl, thank you for the super sticker. Catardist asking me, if Richard Allen is found innocent, can he turn around and sue the state for a lot of money for his mistreatment? Interesting that you asked that question, because in the courtroom today for the testimony that I'll get to in a minute, the confessions, in the courtroom were several lawyers sitting in the back from the AG's office, and from the Department of Corrections. They were there. My guess would be because they were concerned about whether or not the people testifying, who were all employees of the Department of Corrections at one point, would they have maybe liability? Would there be anything they would need to know related to this case or also other cases? Because there is, of course, some suggestion that there's oversight of this, that maybe the feds are looking into it. If so, they are trying to get on top of it. So I thought that was really interesting. I don't know. Could he sue the state for a lot of money for his mistreatment? This was extreme. It's really, really hard for a prisoner to win one of these cases. Those are super hard. Prisoners aren't particularly likable in terms of plaintiffs. And then, the Department of Corrections, well, they deal with a bunch of crooks and hoodlums. Maybe they have to do this. So these are difficult cases to win. But potentially, yes, potentially, certainly the treatment in his case was very, very extreme. And thank you. I really appreciate it, Susan. And Mango Tango 23 is a new member. So this is a good question Vesper has. Does Richard Allen seem savvy or with it enough to do this without leaving DNA on anything? How many 40-year-olds suddenly commit this crime out of the blue? You've got to figure it's a very, very small number who do this. He does seem awfully out of character. That's why when they suddenly mentioned yesterday that in that email that he gave them in the interview on October 13th, they mentioned that they wanted to put in some evidence related to searches done on that email that were sexual in nature. If so, that could change the character of things. But for right now, there's nothing really to suggest that he is the kind of guy who would suddenly do this. And so Is he the kind savvy enough to do this without leaving DNA? I find that mystifying in general. I don't care who it is. To have this brutal a crime scene and nothing left, no DNA, no blood, is remarkable, just absolutely remarkable. The only thing remaining was that one cartridge in the ground between the girl's feet. Was it connected? Law enforcement believes it was, and that they've traced it directly to Richard Allen's gun. Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. I really appreciate that. The hotel fund. Thank you so much. Yes, this is a little different from watching a case on the computer and reporting on it at night. This is a little more all-in involvement. So thank you. I really appreciate that. All right, well, let's dive back in, and I'll have some more people to thank. You and I both know what happened. It's easier if you help me, says law enforcement. And Richard Allen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I did something I didn't. That's exactly what you want me to do. Now, an interesting thing about that is, on its face, that's pretty much what you would expect an innocent person to say when being interrogated. Later, however, he confesses while he is in prison for that period of time. We're going to get to those confessions. That's the next thing we're going to be talking about. One of the things that the defense says is, that the prosecution says is, he's saying he would never confess to something he didn't do, and he did confess, so that's more evidence that he really meant it by the time he confessed. He says, I never even seen him. I never seen those two girls. The very day they said they want everyone to come in, if they were there, I did. My wife will say there's no way in hell I'd ever do this, so we're all good. Like, I am not worried about my wife. Oh, and he's, oh my God, I have been honest with you, and I'm trying to act it out because he was, and you obviously don't believe me. There's no way possible that a round from my gun ended up at a murder scene. So something's obviously wrong. I didn't do it. You obviously think I did it. I've got nothing to get out in front of. I'm not going to tell you I did something I didn't do. And he said that a bunch. He was, at this point, left alone again. He was shaking his head. He was dejected, very slumped, relaxed. He had his head hung. And as a trial note, his wife, sitting over the side, had her head down in her hand, I think kind of that way. It was obviously very difficult for her to watch as well. Then I also thought this was a huge contrast, because what we are about to turn to, a few more pages. But what we're about to turn to is the confessions. And there, a completely different person is described. On the one hand, right over here, you've got this guy who's very articulate and confident and saying, I didn't do that, very much equal to them, forceful in what he says. I didn't do that. I'm not going to say that I did. And then listen, when we get to it, to how they describe the person he became when he was in isolation for a long period of time, over a year in the end. He said, they say your wife said something negative about him. He said, I think I know my wife. And they said, you didn't tell her you've been lying to her for years. We know you have anger issues. Your wife knows. He says it's depression. He says, I didn't murder two little girls. And they say to him, the evidence doesn't lie. He says, it obviously does. It was really a well-done interview. I'm sorry, but it was. There's no way a bullet from my gun ended up at the scene. It just didn't happen. I'm not lying to you. I can't. Oh, wait, this is other side. This is law enforcement now. Law enforcement says, I'm not lying to you. I can't. That's unethical. Can you believe that? I mean, really, the gall. Not only is he lying, but he's saying it would be unethical if I did. Well, yes, it was unethical, and you did lie. And I really don't know where we got to the state in this country that it's just fine for law enforcement to lie in interviews. I find that appalling. So his head was hung. He was dejected. His arms were relaxed, one on each leg. They had a ballistics report sitting right there, and he didn't look at it. He even seemed maybe to go to sleep at some point sitting up. I don't think we're, here he says, I don't think you're a bad person. Neither does your wife, says the interrogator. And he says, what kind of good person would kill 2 people. Now, the prosecutor used that as if it were evidence against Richard Allen. I don't get that. How is that evidence against Richard Allen? When he says, what kind of good person would kill 2 people? That seems to me more like he's saying, I don't want to be, if that's what good people do, don't put me in that category. And they said good people make bad decisions all the time. Good people get out in front of it and try to help. I don't know how you get out in front of the murder of 2 innocent young girls. I don't think you do. He says, oh my God, I didn't do anything. I didn't murder 2 little girls. I wasn't doing what you'd say, scheming. I never even seen them before. He seemed kind of close to tears about this point. He was shaking his head. He's almost stopped responding, like he was just giving up. And then they send his wife in while it's just the 2 of them, and they hug. But I will say this was interesting. The interaction between them I found really interesting because, you know, they share a good hug. But after that, she's sitting over here and he's right here. And, you know, I can see where if you were really worried about somebody, maybe you're patting them and hugging them. Not that. She's sitting over here. She's away from him. Sorry if the sound went bad on that, but she's sitting, you know, just not right up next to him, not leaning in. The body language isn't, I'm with you, I'm on your side. The body language is more separate. At that point, so I'm assuming that right then, at least she was wondering. And she is crying in stereo because she's crying on the video. And in real life, she's sitting there in the courtroom and she's crying. Both are happening at the same time. And he says to her, they really think I did it and they want to believe. I'm not going to say something that's not true. It's not possible. There's no way. And he says, I know you know me. I know you know I didn't do this. She says, she doesn't say, yes, of course I know that. She says, they have a bullet from your gun. And how'd it get there? And Richard Allen says, how'd it get there? I can't explain it. And then we've got, you know, the wives video in real life. They're both in tears. And he says, I don't know how to explain something that isn't possible. At this point, one of the things I saw in the courtroom, there's a juror who sits on the very end nearest the gallery. At this point, and remember, they don't know who's who. I don't think they would have a way of knowing who Richard Allen's wife is. But he turns and he spots this woman crying. And he's looking, video woman. And he, I think, realizes this must be Richard Allen's wife. And he turns and she's crying with her head down. And he just intensely looks at her for a long period of time, kind of evaluating and thinking, what do I think about her reaction? It was really interesting to watch. It's one of the most pronounced reactions I've seen by the jurors. This guy in particular, he's a little easier to see because he's down at the end, but he also has some more pronounced reactions. So I noticed that one today. So let's see, I'm not going to say I did something I didn't do. I can't tell you how many times he said that. I should just stop highlighting that. He said it a bunch, add 20 more times. And he says, I'm sorry you're having to go through it. He says, I'm sorry I'm having to go through it. She asked, why the gun? He says, there are 2 explanations. Number 1, it didn't come from my gun. Number 2, it didn't come from the murder scene. There's no way. I mean, he was spot on that something is wrong here because that's not my bullet at a murder scene. He came across to me as a regular guy, not narcissistic, not manipulative. The only thing that I kind of read a little off was when the wife came in that he just said, you know me, you know I didn't do it. Where clearly her reaction was, why does it do that? That's so interesting. I guess I'm supposed to be able to do a signal. I don't know why it does. Did you see the thumbs up? Yesterday I had hearts. I don't know how that all happens. I think what was a little off was that the wife did seem to have some questions, like why they're telling me your gun and the bullet are a direct match and that it's a fingerprint. How is this possible? And she didn't seem to fully be on board with yeah, it's not you. And his reaction was good, just, you know me. You know it's not me. Very confidently. Whereas it seemed to me, reading the room, she wasn't fully on board yet. And the better answer would have been, surely you trust me. Surely you know that I wouldn't do this, and try to get a response back from the person. And it wasn't like that. He just seemed very confident that she would believe this. But that was the only little thing I noticed. And I'm not quite sure what way to read that. I just wanted to point that out because I'm trying to give you observations. And then there was a period where we'd heard about it yesterday from Jerry Holman on the stands, where he says, you're too effing bullheaded to get out in front of it. And you're going to put your family through this for no reason. And then it kind of breaks down even worse from there. You want to F with me, but leave my wife out of it. So they come back in, law enforcement does. Richard Allen says, you want to F with me, well, leave my wife out of it. And Holman begins screaming and saying things like, you effing killed them. And, you know, things that are very, very accusatory directly. And Richard Allen says, I'm not talking, arrest me, law enforcement. I'm glad to. I tried to help you. And Richard Allen says, yeah, you're really trying to help. And then we get to the confessions. So let me thank a few more people and we will hop into the confessions. Thank you, anyone. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, 9AB. I appreciate that. I'm really spoiled. Missed it on Sunday. Oh, my goodness. Well, I was still glad to get a day off. Thank you, 9AB. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that very much. And Carrie and Lute's channel, I appreciate your super chat as well. Melissa Hicks is asking, what if Richard Allen refused to talk and got an attorney on day one? It would not have helped him, Melissa. That is my view. It wouldn't have done him a bit of good. They had decided they were going to arrest him. There is nothing in that interview that implicates him. The only thing would be maybe that he changed the time from 1:30 to 3:30 to 12 to 1:30. And given that it was 5 years later, I don't see that as a huge problem. He still seemed to think it was earlier when they confronted him with what he had said later, but I wouldn't pick that up as enormous, just speaking personally. Grammy Sandy is a new member. Welcome. So Liz is correct. Lots of guys, and making the same point Richard Allen did, lots of people have blue or black jackets, jeans, and a cap, and even a Carhartt jacket. But on the same day, the girls were killed at a remote park with almost no other people in it. Well, according to the sketches, there could have been as many as 4 people. They looked so different, and they were in different parts of the park. So were other people there? It's not 100% clear, but is it possible that it was Richard Allen, or at least that it was the guy wearing the Carhartt jacket, jeans, and a cap? That's exactly what the jury is going to have to decide. On the one hand, you could argue lots of people wear that. On the other hand, you could argue just what you do, Liz, that how many people wear that on that day in that park at that time, and there's a murder that happens. Holeswood. I'm glad. Thanks. I'm glad you like the coverage. And Lori is a new member. Welcome. And Grammy Sandy. Appreciate the super sticker. And Barb. Oh, thank you for the coffee fund. Yes, or the Diet Coke fund in my case. I appreciate it very much. All right, we're going to stop right there for a minute. We'll come back to the questions in the comments, but I want to dive into the confessions because it is the moment we have been waiting for. I thought it was so important to have these two bracket each other on the same day. Start off the day with these interviews where you see this one persona of Richard Allen, confident, poised, completely clear that he did not do this, and contrast it with the man who confessed multiple times. I am guessing that the prosecution is not going to bring all the inmates who were watching Richard Allen and have them testify about all the confessions. It's going to limit it to the confessions heard by the guards. And they seem to be the reason we went so late today. They got guard after guard after guard, and we went all the way till 6:30. I think they wanted to run all the way through them. They had the witnesses there and lined up. They wanted to get it knocked out and done. We also heard first and foremost from the former warden, John Gallipo, former warden of the Westfield Department of Corrections. One of the strange things about Richard Allen's ordeal has been that he has been kept in a prison instead of a jail. Normally, people who have not yet been convicted are kept in jail while they're awaiting trial. In this particular case, the local police said, we can't really keep him here in this jail. Not safe for him. So even before he had a lawyer, a safekeeping order was entered and he was transferred to a prison where he was held in isolation in an observation cell, not just for the 1 to 3 months that's the maximum recommended, but for over a year. And his defense team believes that broke him down mentally to the point where he confessed. That's the argument they're making here. So they started, since they were still on the prosecution's case. This is a prosecution's witness. And he tried to make it sound as if the treatment Richard Allen has received is equal to what others have received. And hey, prison's just a tough life. That's what you get. That's what you deserve. So the observation cell they talked about is where you get put if you have a mental health issue, which Richard Allen did because of his depression and because of his unaliving ideation. So he had a bed with a mattress. They said it's not different from other mattresses right there. Everybody on the floor gets the same thing. You get a bed frame that's bolted to the floor. Everybody gets the same thing. You get a shower 3 times a week. That's what everybody gets. You get 3 sets of clothing a week. You get 2 electronic tablets. Everything is either the same or better. And then the warden said he confessed to me 2 times in person and gave in a request for interviews. So he wrote out a request for an interview with the warden and said, this is the first confession offered by the prosecution. I'm ready to officially confess killing Abby and Libby. That's how they read it. It's a little bit off. I get the chance, or I hope I get the chance to tell the families. At one point, the warden says he gave a detail that he worked at CVS and disposed a box cutter that he had used to kill the girls at CVS in the dumpster. That is not to the warden, so not to be confused. He mentioned it, but all that was said was this: I'm ready to officially confess killing Abby and Libby. There was on cross-examination, then the defense said, well, that went through the fact that he had custody, and that's very unusual. Normally, there would not be somebody who would be in this prison who hasn't been convicted yet, who is still presumed innocent. In this particular case, it's a medium security prison, but it has a maximum security area, and the medical security prison, within the medium security prison, and the place where someone who is under unaliving watch would go is in the middle of this, so that they are watched full time. He said the only difference between the 54 cells around and the one devoted for unaliving watch is the bed and the camera. The camera, he said, sits right in the center in the ceiling and can see the entire room. So there is no privacy. The room is 8 by 10. Rick Allen's mattress was on top of a metal slab that was bolted to the floor. It was basically on the floor, the defense said. He was not aware of any other circumstances where someone who was presumed innocent was held in a cell as he was for more than a year. The camera on the ceiling is on 24 hours a day. He was asked, and there's no privacy. He said, well, not a lot. The lights are on. He can dim them. There's a window that's a narrow slat looking at a razor wire fence. The toilet is next to the bed, and there's no contact with other inmates other than they yell at each other. And the things yelled at him were, and I think this witness didn't say it, but others did. I'm just throwing in baby killer and unalive yourself. He was handed food through a slot in the door. He was allowed to have a cardboard box to hold his TV. If he went out of the cell, he was shackled and chained and walked on a leash. He got recreation 5 times a week. But what recreation consisted of, he was never allowed to go to the green space for recreation. They did a pretty good cross on this. He showed a map up there. He's like, this is the prison yard, right? See this green space here where you can play ball? He never got to go to that, right? this green space over here where you could do this. He didn't get to go to that. And they went through all. I'm like, nope, he never went to any of those. Instead, his rec was a 10 by 15 room. And there was an outside rec that had a roof with a screen around it so you could get air, but there was a roof over it. And he called it a cage. He was not allowed to have playing cards. He had to pay for movies or music. Phone calls were recorded and his tablet was monitored. He was monitored during the shower. And if he went on mental health care, he would then be monitored during the shower. His recreation would be decreased. He got constant observation and he had to wear a kimono kind of looking thing, smock that went shoulders to knees with straps on the side. And he would get less of everything if he was on that watch, which he was immediately within 7 hours of entering the place. He had during this time 2 visitations with his wife. And during those, he had to be walked with hand restraints, leg irons, and a transportation lead, they call it, or as Rosie called it, a dog leash. No food or snacks, no water, no bathroom. If you doubt any of those things, if somebody had to go to the bathroom, then your whole visit, that's it. That's terminated. It's the end of it. So you could, if you got hungry, too bad. If you needed water, bathroom, whatever, don't do it. It's like being in Judge Gull's courtroom. Do not try to leave because you have to go to the bathroom because you will not get back in. Same rules, actually, now that I think about it. Attorney calls were not recorded. And this was really interesting. It was an aside. It wasn't something they had to talk about, but he said, well, attorney calls are not recorded. Rosie says, how do you know? How do you know it's a call from an attorney so you stop recording? And he said, well, they had a list, but basically it did look pretty sketchy as to how exactly they know when and do they actually stop recording. Talked about videotaping the meeting between the attorneys and Richard Allen. You made him sit in a specific chair with a camera focused on him, even though he was never a threat to the physical safety of officers. Twice they did tase him because even though his cell door was locked, he wouldn't move his hands from that hole in the door. So they couldn't close it. And so they tased him. But they called this being treated better than others. That's what he called it. The unaliving companions who were with him constantly and were to record everything that he said were not supposed to interact with him. And they were not supposed to, in theory, the idea behind it was protect him, right? Keep him from hurting himself. But instead, they were recording everything that he said. That was their task. And they weren't supposed to interact with him, but we can see from the ones they interviewed, well, they clearly did. The warden said that Richard Allen had a sudden catastrophic change in his mentation, in his mental health status on April 3rd. That was the day he received some documents, legal mail, they called it, from his lawyers. And that the guards at that point, because of his change in condition, replaced the inmate companion. So up until that point, the people with him 24 hours sitting outside his room were other inmates who were just tasked with doing that. But now it was going to be guards. And it was 13 solid months that this occurred, that Richard Allen was in this particular living condition. They started to get into a little discussion with the warden. You were fired, right? And the warden says, let go. And Rosie wants to get into his belief that the reason for the firing was in part the way that Richard Allen was treated and the appalling treatment that was being given with not just Richard Allen, but others being held in solitary confinement far more than was advised or than was supposed to happen. So at this point, though, the judge upheld the objection that this was outside the scope of direct, which was kind of a funny objection because it was impeachment saying that while it's true that his job and leaving the warden wasn't on direct examination, this was more in the sense of this is impeachment for why he's no longer there and for the question of whether or not the holding people in solitary confinement for that long is really inappropriate. So let's see. it was funny. They had long speaking objections during this. A lot of this would have been lost on the jury, except that both lawyers, Rosie and Cleland, gave long speaking objections. Well, Judge, what I want to show is that the reason he was fired has to do with neglecting his duties and things like that. So the jury would be like, oh, okay, now I get it. And McClellan did the same thing in just a little bit. All right, so let's see. Yeah, 7 hours after he got there, he's put on that. Next witness, Ethan Drang. He's with the Department of Corrections, was for 2.5 years at Westville, same prison. And we're going to go through the confessions each one of them knows about. So at 8:46, Richard Allen asked Ethan if he wanted to take a Bible. He said, "It cure my depression, allow me to find God. Do you want my Bible?" Which none of this probably makes sense. There may be two reasons. I could have misheard things, always a possibility, but more the point was that it was confusing and that Richard Allen was losing his mental health abilities. Wanted to confess, and he said he wanted to confess to killing Abby and Libby. And how did that happen? He read that on the slip that was being passed out to the warden. Note the date. The date on this is April 5th. So at this point, the warden had said on April 3rd, he moved Richard Allen. And by that point, he knew that he wanted to confess. But this slip written to the warden is on April 5th. So later, Rosie made a point of that problem, that the move and the change that was done by the warden was on April 3rd. And this slip written to the warden wasn't until April 5th. So how did that happen? Cross-examination was, okay, yeah, he said that he wanted to confess about Libby and Abby, but it actually was, this was the Bible and everything else, and he wanted to confess to killing Abby and Libby, and he wrote that on the slip. So just beforehand, about an hour and a half beforehand, he had been crying and screaming in a pretty bad way, and he was emotional, talked about finding a life in prison, said, "I've come to prison to cure my depression and anxiety." And at this point, they pulled him out to talk to the mental health professional there, Walla. I think she'll be testifying tomorrow, and that's going to be huge. You don't want to miss tomorrow night's recap, because that's going to be really important. He slipped an envelope under the door and said, "I hope I get the opportunity to tell the victims I'm sorry." And all of this. So I would call that really only one extra confession, because of the fact that one was just where he saw what he had written to the warden. And so I don't count that. But this other one where he talks about, I hope I get the opportunity to tell the victims I'm sorry, I would count that one. And then the next witness, Mike Clemens, on April 7th, Richard Allen said, "God, I'm so glad nobody gave up on me after I killed Abby and Libby." And then at 8:01 a.m. said, and I'll count these as two more confessions, "I, Richard M. Allen, killed Abby and Libby all by myself. Nobody helped me." These are, pretty clear and direct. And then at 8:03 a.m., to answer the question I was just about to pose, "I'm not crazy. I'm only acting like I'm crazy." Of course, the prosecution says that's the whole point. He's acting. This is all pretend. He's not really crazy. And cross-examination said, "Well, you were told to sit next to his cell and to write down everything he said. And Richard Allen didn't tell you what he did to those girls." And he said, "No, it was very generic." And he said, "Yes, it was." And he referred to you, Ethan, as God, right? And he said, "Yes." And he said, back to that comment about "I'm not crazy, I'm only acting like I'm crazy." Well, that was actually Richard Allen responding to other inmates. A bunch of people were yelling at him to unalive himself, baby killer. And he said, "I'm not crazy, I'm only acting like I'm crazy," responding to these people who were yelling at him. On redirect, he didn't think a change in behavior was genuine. And witness after witness said this, that they believed, and by witness after witness, I mean each of them was a Department of Corrections, either officer or present officer, and they all said they saw this dramatic change in his behavior, but they thought it was fake. They thought he was trying to accomplish something. What exactly was he trying to accomplish? We have to ask that question, because I think what they're saying is his lawyers kind of put him up to it. He got this legal mail and decided he was going to pretend to be crazy. But why? What's the point of that? It might have been one thing if what he wanted was better living conditions and maybe a move to the jail, and his lawyers had told him, see what you can do to get out of there and move back over here to jail. Maybe if you act crazy, they'll move you. But that can't be the case because it's accompanied by the worst possible thing from his legal status, which is a host of confessions. There's no way the lawyers recommended that, and it doesn't really make sense. Why would he be acting crazy in order to and then confess? Just act crazy. You don't have to confess also. That's what makes me think that it's not. That coupled with the fact that the person I saw on those videos seemed very compelling that he did not believe he was guilty. He was rock solid on that. So it seems like a really big contrast to me. All right. So there was a juror question. Is it possible you were documenting Mr. Allen could be shouting out to other inmates? And he said, which confused me no end. I didn't understand the question at all. And the witness, there was this kind of silence. Finally, I guess it's possible because I don't think anyone understood that question. But I did not think the questions were at all hostile to the defense today. I thought they were really probing, probably in the right directions, the very places where the jury would be expected to have questions about this. So the next witness, Michael Roberts, and there were 10 witnesses today, in addition to the 2 interviews, said that on April 7th, a lot of this clustered around a few days in April. Richard Allen said, "Dear Lord, forgive me for an inappropriate touching," there was a different word used, "of Abby, Libby, and Chris," which I'm not sure who Chris is, maybe his daughter. But then at 1 p.m., "Dear God, forgive me for inappropriate touching of Abby, Libby, Kevin, and Chris." So the list grew, and no one was sure, like, why? Who are all these people? "I want to confess I know a lot more," he stated. "What more do I got to do?" he says. And then at 2 p.m. on the 23rd of April, he says, "I killed Abby and Libby. My wife wasn't involved. I'd like to confess." 3 days later, he says, "Can I talk? Can you listen? I killed Abby and Libby." Same day, "How do I prove that I'm not sane?" I may not have gotten that one right. That's not written fully legibly, even to me, the person who wrote it, but that's what I think I wrote. On 6/18, he said, "Why are you doing this? Do you know why I'm here? I killed Abby and Libby." On 6/21, June 21st, "Have I told you about my wife? I killed Abby and Libby." I mean, just sometimes real segues where the heading in one way and now I've told you about my wife. By the way, I killed Abby and Libby. Just real confusing things. This particular witness said when he first came in, Richard Allen was normal, coherent, talkative, and after 1 to 3 months, he noticed changes. It was like he was not there, like he couldn't hear you, he couldn't talk, and he felt like it was doing outrageous things to get attention, that he would wait until someone was watching, wait until you're watching, and then he would act up and act crazy. And there was a great question from the juror at the end. Juror was like, I thought there was a camera overhead at all times. So isn't someone always watching? Why does he need to wait? Couldn't he just do it and someone would see it automatically? So primary concern of Richard Allen's on cross, he pointed out, was for the family. And he said he had the list grew again, inappropriately touched Abby, Libby, Chris, Kevin, and now added Dawn to this in August. Was that August? I'm not sure the date on that. I don't have the date right there. He said it was not this witness, that it was not a disorder if a person rubs feces on themselves, but if they eat it, then that would be crazy. And in fact, that did happen with Richard Allen. So Rosie said, well, if I told you he was eating his feces, would that change your mind? Because he kept pushing them. Didn't you think he had a mental health problem? Didn't you think maybe you ought to refer him to the doctor, that he needed some help, that there was something weird going on? And time after time, they said, nah, this is normal for around there. So he said, well, okay, what if I told you he has been eating his feces? He said, well, that still wouldn't count unless I saw it. And he did acknowledge that the other inmates were doing the yelling that we talked about. He asked the witness to read him his last rites. He was tapping his head on the wall for long periods of time, but not all that hard. And the witness, Rosie, said, well, you questioned the authenticity. And the witness said, yeah, he wasn't like slamming his head. So I just figured he, just didn't pay any attention to it. But he did it for a really long period, to the point where his entire face was black and blue. And then they informed the supervisor. He also refused food. He ran in place naked. On the 7th of April, he said, God, I'm sorry for wasting your time. I'll never smoke, cheat on my wife again. I'm a Libra. I may have written that down wrong. That was such a segue, but that was the point. So maybe not. He talked about rolling around on the ground, that Richard Allen would roll around on the ground. And he didn't call anybody because he figured, well, that's not really self-harm. And that's the only time they call somebody if there's apparently an actual attempt. He swear another comment by Richard Allen, I swear I never cheated on a cigarette. That could be a country song, couldn't it? I swear I never cheated on a cigarette. So make of it what you will. Is everything you laud videoed or audio recorded? Asked a juror. Yes. And do you know if the recordings are saved? Didn't know. All right, we're going to move to another witness, but first let me say thanks to some people. Okay, LK Ryden is asking me a question about Abby having clothes to stop the nature or weather to move the clothes and being found. Saying, you scream, run, I'll kill your friend. Yes, I think that is something that could have happened. Trauma is many kids don't scream or freeze because their brain can't process it. And I got a really interesting, thoughtful email from somebody saying, I, as an adult, my husband and I were... I think they had walked into their home and there's somebody there, and the person says, get down, I've got a gun. And they didn't scream. They could have, they didn't. And they wondered later, why didn't we? But it was just such a surprise and so overwhelming. They didn't even think about it. They just did what they were told. And I think that's a good point. I don't think it's always clear how people act. One of the things the defense has talked about is the fact that no one in the park heard them scream or heard them run, heard them yell for help, anything like that. And maybe they could have gotten away if the two of them had worked together. Maybe one would have gotten away. At least a scream would have been heard. But you have a really good point that it may have had something to do with that. So I don't know about the clothes part, LK. I'm not sure about that. Left of You wants to know, why did they rule out Klein as bridge guy? As I understand it, the reasoning behind that was that they found his computer was being used at his home during some of the time. To be honest, it seemed later than the time of the murders, more like evening, but they felt like that proved that he couldn't have been in the vicinity of where the girls were found. I really did think, though, they had said they slept all day and woke up at night, he and his dad. So I didn't really see how it worked. But since I don't know the actual numbers of when exactly it was, I can't answer that question precisely. But I think that was the reason why. Trina Sloan, thank you. I appreciate that. Liz, thank you again. I may have put that up before, but we definitely talked about that. Thank you, Liz. If I was a glorified paper filer, such as Kathy Shank, I would never be so presumptuous as to take a file to someone which was already marked as cleared. She took it straight to the man who was running for sheriff, too. But it did seem like, she was a long-time volunteer. They were probably pretty lucky to have someone who stuck with it for so long and without pay. So maybe she may have had a lot of clout around there for that reason. But it was surprising that she took it to the person running for sheriff, as opposed to anybody else in the group. Maybe he was the one she saw as in charge, but that's how it worked. Thank you, Elrod. Staying warm, a constant challenge here. Lynn Rudham, new member, welcome. Why can't the defense put on Abby's ex-boyfriend on the stand about the sus spit comment to police without accusing him as a suspect, just to see if he cracks under pressure? So I think the person who made the spit comment was not the ex-boyfriend, but was Elvis Fields. And he made that comment, I think, to police. All of that evidence, all of it has been ruled out by the judge. So the defense is not allowed to present evidence about third parties who may have committed this crime. That's been ruled out in this particular case. The judge is going to accept a proffer, but there's no indication. Sometimes a proffer is made when the judge is making a decision. And the judge says, okay, well, show me what you got. Okay, I'm going to decide yes or no. They did that this summer. They had a hearing. And the judge said, I'm not going to let it in. The proffer will be for more evidence to come in that could support it, primarily, though, for appeal. I don't think the judge plans to revisit this and make a decision again about whether or not she's going to let this in. I think it's just out. That's her decision. So none of that's coming in. Was he indicted by a grand jury? I don't know exactly what process they used. I would not be surprised, but I don't know exactly what process they used here in Indiana or for his case. Bleeding Green in Texas asked me, I think his wife found it difficult to believe the police would lie, which most people do. Yes. And may I say, Bleeding Green, that applies to the jury too, which is why these cases have a 99% prosecution win rate. At least that's the federal number. It's something crazy like that. 99, pretty close to 99. I don't know in Indiana, but it is normal for the prosecution to win. Now, you like to think that's because the prosecution only brings cases they know they're going to win, cases that are meritorious. But it's an overwhelming percentage. Whit James, his world could have been told anything before his wife could have been told anything before going in the room. They probably lied to her. Well, that is very possible because although they said it was unethical, they also did so and acknowledged that not only did they do so, but that it was allowed for them to do that. Nana of 7, I could not agree with you more. This is why you asked for a lawyer before being interrogated instead of waiting until afterwards. Yes, that is exactly why. Robin H, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to thank a couple more people and then we will dive back into our confessions and you will hear even more. Helen, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And Whit James is saying for his confessions, he was on Haldol and in solitary. I can see him confessing, hoping to get out of solitary. I can too. Also, will they let in all the other confessions that didn't happen, like killing the grandma's parents? Yes, that's all coming in. And that is the perfect segue. I'm going to pull that out. I'll put Sky Goddess up because it's a little smaller so you can still see me. Thank you for making me laugh about Judge Call's strict rules. Thank you. Yes, a lot like solitary confinement. All right. So James Early, next witness. Here are more confessions by Richard Allen. I am ready to confess. I swear to God, I killed Abby and Libby. F you, Ryan. That's what I heard. Sometimes you weren't clear. Okay, well, am I just having bad ears here? Or is this just yet another crazy segue that they're putting in? Can't confess to the warden. Oh, sorry. Can't I? At 8:50 a.m. on May 1st, Richard Allen said, can I confess to the warden and Dr. Walla? Then on cross-examination, and the cross-examination was good every time. Rosie is so mad about these, so clearly upset. He said, are you aware he had already written a letter in early April, but then he told you on May 1st he wanted to confess. He'd already written the letter. So why do it again? And the witness said that when Richard Allen first got to the facility, he was kind of deer in headlights, big eyes all the time, and that his behavior changed, quote, flipped a switch. At one point, someone told him, you might not want to go down there, told the witness this. He's eating his Bible. He was drinking out of the toilet. He used a spork on his genitals. He covered himself with feces. He was then on another occasion was drinking toilet water and a bottle of hot sauce, which I guess he got from commissary. He was on the floor mumbling. There was a lot of mumbling again, mumble. There was a whole lot of that. And I had so many notes that not only did I fill up my entire notebook, I had to go to the back of the page. All right, so continued on James Early. He said, but he felt that he was being manipulative, that he was faking this, that he would be like dead weight and they would have to carry him. And then, but if he saw something he wanted, then he would suddenly come out of that and emerge from it. For example, he said that when he was drinking that toilet water, he took a breath before he did it. Like, don't want to do this, but here we go. That was the description by the witness. Are you aware, said Rosie, that he was banging his head until he was injured? Witness just said, well, not on my shift. But he questioned the genuineness of all of his pretense, they would call it, of becoming crazy and going down into this mental health crisis. He said, some people just want to do this to get something. It draws attention. Do you know how long he was on unaliving watch? He was in the same, this is really amazing. This is an 8x10 cell, right? Nobody else goes out at most a few times a week while being led on a leash and in shackles. He was in that same cell for 13 months. That is amazing. No window. Remember that little slit looking on barbed wire. What did they on? Was this still? I'm not. Oh, this was after the juror question was, do you know how long he was on suicide watch? I thought that was a really good question because it suggested they were thinking about, you know, how would someone fare mentally if they had to go through this, and they then listed what could be in a cell if you were on unaliving watch. You could have a tablet, Wi-Fi, a Bible, a phone if you asked, and reading materials. And on redirect, they mentioned also commissary. You could order some things there, get some food, extra clothing, things like that from the commissary. And you would be wearing a suicide blanket, which Rosie described as caveman looking, a smock. And Rosie's point was, yes, but he's not an offender yet. He called him some offenders wear this or that. He said he's not an offender. He's not actually done anything or been convicted. Next witness, John Miller, at 6:58 a.m. on the 9th of April. Remember, these do really cluster in that early April time. He said, I killed Abby and Libby. He was putting paper down the toilet. At 7:04 a.m., 6 minutes later, he said, the funniest joke is how I killed them. He started to shout foul words. At 7:24 a.m., he said, I got what I deserved for what I did. I hope I burn in hell for what I did. At 7:55 a.m., he said, I'm sorry for what I did. I don't care, killing them. And he was crying. At 7:58 a.m., he said, I'm sorry I killed those kids. Now, this witness felt that he was mentally stable and that his, at the time, at least, he was faking it, but that when he came in on 11/22, November of 2022, he was very mentally stable and his demeanor was normal in every aspect. Oh, wait, I have to go this way. All right, we are approaching the end, and then I can get into some more questions. All right, checking the time. Here we go. And this was the answer to your question. He said he probably killed his own family and grandkids, that he inappropriately touched his sister, that he may have touched his daughter inappropriately, and that he had what words? I don't know the words. In his sleep over all of this, he had moments of pleasure, I guess I would be. Old bear claw was a word that he said fairly frequently, apparently. I'm like, what does that mean? They said, do you know what it means? No, I don't. Well, then why are you telling us this? I don't understand. He was pacing, hitting the walls. He hit the door with his head in his hands. He cried, he sang, and he yelled cuss words. All right. John Miller was mumbling. John Miller is the next witness. Continued witness. Here's another confession on 4/9. I only killed them to give my family more time to live, and I don't want to be free. Can't stop the bank from trying. That can't possibly be what I wrote. Can't stop the bank from trying. I don't think he said that. I don't know exactly what was written there. Sorry. My wife is dead because of what I did, he said, which is not true. She was sitting in the courtroom. Next witness, Brandon Fisher, on 4/20, he asked, Richard Allen did, to talk to the warden. On 4/29, he said, I killed 2 girls in Delphi with box cutters. I stole them and stole it and left it in the CVS trash. So he's saying he stole box cutters and left them in the CVS trash. The date of that, April 29th, is pretty important because by then he did have information from his attorneys about the case. That had come in early April. One of the things the prosecution has said is that Richard Allen had new details, things he shouldn't have known about the murder. One of them, they say, is this box cutters. Other than that, it's pretty much, as you can hear, pretty generic. I killed Libby and Abby. I'm responsible for that. As opposed to here, where he says that he killed them with box cutters, and it's possible they were killed with a straight knife on at least some of the cuts, and I stole it and left it in the CVS trash. Although the prosecution can't prove that, they're willing to accept that that might be what he did. All right, so at 6:30 p.m. on 5/18, he said that he tried to R Libby and Abby, but I got scared and killed them instead. He said that at 6:30 p.m. Now, that is interesting because remember that there was some suggestion, perhaps, of male DNA with Libby and Abby, but there was no sign of actual violence or anything like that. And so maybe the prosecution will argue that what the DNA showed matches what what he says here about wanting to do to Libby and Abby, but not doing. All right. So he said he wanted to write his confession on April 29th, but he already had, the cross pointed out. He was banging his head on the door. That day that he said that about R on Abby and Libby, he also had a small gash on his head from banging his head so much. So he clearly was in mental chaos at the time. Continuing with Brandon Fisher, he stated that he lost his virginity to the babysitter next door at age 11, said it was an R situation. So I think I heard that right. And the girls were screaming when he did it. This is Libby and Abby, flash forward. He's saying they were screaming when he did it. Super interesting, right? Because we know that's fake. That's false. They were not screaming. We talked a little bit ago. Should they have been, or maybe they were just scared. Maybe it was too much to expect young girls to do that. And sometimes that's not how you'd react anyway, as I pointed out. So, but this isn't true. So is this another example the defense can use of a fact he threw in that's simply false, thus illustrating he's really in mental breakdown. He's not truly confessing. He said he was living in the 1300s or 1400s, and he meant it, the witness said. He would talk normally and then want me to read Bible verses, but he also put feces on his face, did it again, and said, you knew right from wrong. Oh, another example of pretty much any objection by the state is granted by Judge Gall. So this one was, the witness had said he knew right from wrong. And Rosie said, but you lied on an application. And the judge didn't allow that, saying that it was outside the scope. Again, Rosie's argument was maybe it's related to the credibility of the witness. I'm impeaching the witness's truthfulness. All right, the juror, there were a ton of juror questions, and they didn't flag. Later as the day wore on and we went later and later, I thought maybe they'd be like, no questions. No, they kept going. They were all in on wanting to know what the witnesses would say. So one asked, did your training tell you to de-escalate or merely to observe and report? So they wanted to know, if you see him acting crazy, are you supposed to do something to make it stop, or you're just supposed to sit back and watch it? And the witness said, I'm just supposed to observe and report. Officer Raymond Smith went next, and he said that on 4/10, right around that April early time frame, that Richard Allen lit the window of his door and said, Kathy, I did it. I'm guilty. Run, Kathy, run. I'm guilty. At 7:55 p.m., he said, I killed those two girls, so I have to kill myself. On the 8th of August, this man was interviewed by law enforcement and gave a statement saying that Richard Allen had said, if I effed those girls, I effed them. If I killed them, I killed them. On 4/10, flashback to 4/10, he was at 2:50 a.m. singing God Bless America At 3:12, he was pleasuring himself in front of the door. And I'm trying to read this. And singing, "Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys." At 3:35, singing "God Bless America, I'm Guilty." At 4:05 a.m., running in place and singing "God Bless America." All right. He told the officer that on redirect, they said, "So you said if I killed them, I killed them." And he seemed like either he was having trouble remembering or he was almost saying that that is what happened. And is this? Oh, no. One more. Jason Bedwell. I think he might be the last one. Here's another confession. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for killing those girls." He was lying down, crying, awake, and talking to himself. And the juror question was he under video or audio monitoring at this time? Oh, here's what's critical about this. Here's what's super critical about this. I don't want to miss this. This witness, Jason Bedwell, I'm getting tired, but we cannot miss this, was from Wabash Correctional. So this is a completely different time frame. And Richard Allen has been moved to another facility. He's not being kept under the exact same conditions. However, the defense is going to point out it's not way different. But this is on February 4th of 2024. So not in the April 2023 timeframe. This is almost a year later. And he's confessing again, saying, "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for killing those girls." So that's critically important because it doesn't fit within the time frame that the defense has said, because the defense's argument was no confession. And boy, can you tell that from the interviews. He is strong that he didn't do this. And then mental health breakdown, confession. And then after that, he stopped confessing because he regained his mental health. But in this particular case, the defense did bring out that he was still in maximum security, an 8x12 cell added a couple feet, concrete walls, no contact with other inmates except through the wall. In other words, his conditions had not changed a lot. He might be in a different facility, but it wasn't wildly different. We did it! We did it! All 60-something pages of the notes. I am so happy. Okay, well, let me finish up over here. And I'll try to take a few questions. You know, I like to do that. Put your question marks at the beginning, but we've gone really long, so I'm not going to be able to do too much. So let me finish up over here. All right. Rebecca, hold up. He said, "Who's this guy who says I helped him?" He did. But I think that there was some discussion. That's exactly right, Rebecca. But I think that there was some discussion around that where they had said, maybe somebody else, maybe you were helping somebody else and it's their fault. And now it's going to be all pinned on you. They were making statements kind of like that. So he was assuming that some guy had turned him in and said, I helped him and I didn't do that, he's saying. But I will say that came a little out of the blue. It didn't really seem to relate to something I had heard in that interrogation so far. Thank you, Melinda. I appreciate that. Daylily Wellness wants to know, now that Ron Logan's come up, can they use that? I don't think so. I don't think the judge will permit any of that to happen. So even Ron Logan. Susan Bray is a new member. Welcome. We're glad to have you, Susan. Spence Marcel, thank you for gifting 10 Lawyer Lee memberships. That's awesome. Be sure you've turned on the ability to receive memberships. Mama Pinks and Marlon, our fantastic moderators, will tell you how in the chat. Did the autopsy show, Una asked, if Abby's neck was broken? Because that could be the reason for less blood. There are just so many questions around the whole issue of Abby. There are some real problems with that. But no, there was no suggestion from the autopsy that I heard that she had her neck broken. She was cut in the front. I think it was this side. I can't remember. But it was more in the front. There would be no reason that it would have gone to the back, and no suggestion of that. There was blood that had run down, which suggested that at some point she had been tilted differently, but the witness who testified about blood spatter said she died right there. We will see what the defense witnesses say. They may have a very different read of that whole situation. Thank you, Vicky. I really appreciate it. And how did Kathy react in court during confessions? She, during the interview, she cried and she reacted strongly. less so during the confessions. And may I say too, we have not heard the phone calls because we understand that there were phone calls he made to his wife and to his mother in which he confessed. We haven't heard those. I would assume those will be coming up, but she didn't have a strong readable reaction. Now, where I am, I don't have like a front-on view of Richard Allen, the jurors, or her. We're kind of in the back of the room, but I could see her somewhat, and I didn't see a strong reaction one way or the other, like shaking her head no or anything like that. All right, and thank you, CBC. I appreciate that very much. All right, so I'm going to head over here, and I better back up a little bit and get some questions in there. So has anyone checked the date from his Google account? Denise Long wants to know. The Google map in the phone. They have his phone, Denise, so I would assume any information they could get, they did, but they were missing the phone that he had on that date. So maybe that's why they weren't able to get that information. Maybe that phone would have yielded it, but he had a bunch of phones in his house, but not that phone. The prosecution thinks that's suspicious. All right. Mia, has he confessed to anything that only the killer would know? I don't really see it. Now, you could argue, I mean, for example, he confessed to some things that were false, but I don't think there's been anything truly that only the killer would have known. I don't really see that yet. I'll be interested to know what the prosecution thinks. And remember, we haven't heard them all. So there might be something more that would still be coming. Deb, what is the vibe from the jurors? Just that they are involved. I honestly, other than that, I don't know. Certainly, one of them was really the same one who was looking at Kathy so intently. Kathy, Richard Allen's wife, Kathy Allen. He was so emotionally affected by that blood spatter testimony, more so than anybody else. You could just visibly see it. And so, as far as I know he was upset, and I know the other witnesses, the other jurors, I'm getting tired. The other jurors had to be definitely feeling the same way. They had to be thinking to themselves, this is overwhelming. But as far as anything other than that, a vibe as to which way they're going, or even just which way the questions are leading, I don't see that yet. I don't see it's anything I can read or tell you. Did the confession start after medication? We've heard nothing about that yet. His doctor will have to give us the timeline for when that got introduced. And I don't think so, because I had a timeline that I'd done before. It's kind of in part of that grayed out part of my timeline. And as I understood, when he got the Haldol, he had confessed one time before the Haldol. I would think that his lawyers would say, yeah, why do you think he got the Haldol? It's because he was going nuts. And they said it was so bad they had to give him this Haldol, whether he wanted it or not. It was critical. All right. So, but we don't know all those dates yet, so I don't want to answer that just yet. But I'll fill it all in on the timeline as soon as we get to that and I have all the information. Ginger, do you think the girls could have screamed but no one heard them? Apparently not. Pretty much all the witnesses say sound carries. It's not really all that far. So evidently, no. Zoe, how could he R the girls without one of them running away? I wondered that too. I don't get it. He didn't have anything with him to constrain either girls, and he can't R them both at the same time. I can't explain that. I really find it hard to believe one person committed this crime. I just am very confused about how that could possibly happen. So that's kind of my lane. Secret Smiler, you started to read a juror question to ask you about a video, but I got distracted. That does happen. That does happen. So what was I going to read? I think what I was reading was about whether or not, so here was why I got distracted. The juror's question was Richard Allen being video and audio taped in this new location? That reminded me that I needed to tell you that this witness, and the reason this witness was so important, was this was a new prison, changed conditions. And yet the confession was continuing several months later. And so the question had been, well, were the same conditions there? Was Richard Allen still being videotaped and audio taped in this new prison? And I believe that the answer was yes. That's what I think I remember. All right, Abby, was Richard Allen's wife or neighbors questioned about his whereabouts or muddy, bloody clothes? Oh, yes. I think they questioned everybody. He was upset, in fact, about the fact that they had gone to his neighbors and were asking questions. He said to his wife over and over in that interrogation room, I actually care. Some people don't care. I care what the neighbors think. I actually want to know. I don't want people to think badly of me. He said that a bunch. So, yes, I think they were asked about that. And obviously, in fact, everything I heard from neighbors was that he was a real likable guy. People seemed to think highly of him and they didn't see him as a bad guy. So I guess what he had done up until then had worked. Giant Stonehead, how did the jury respond to the confessions? They are all over and aren't as illuminating as I might have expected. I agree. They were vague, a lot of them, and he seemed so crazy around this. I think the jury will be really impacted by the order that went in, the interview followed by the confessions, because these were two completely different people. So the guard said over and over, oh, yeah, this is, people act like this all the time. They're just pretending. That's the way it is here in this crazy prison we have. So this is normal here. And I think he was just trying to get attention. But we saw the guy who did those interviews. And the guy who did those interviews is not the guy they were describing, drinking out of the toilet, eating feces. This is the opposite of the guy we saw in the interview. So I think it's going to be really important that the jury saw those. They don't match. I think the jury is going to think he was in serious mental breakdown. He was not just somebody who was trying to make a scene or create some kind of advantage for himself legally. I just don't even see what the advantage would be. I don't get that. All right. Element Rage. How do you personally define reasonable doubt? How do I personally define that? And how have you navigated that idea in this Delphi case? Things can turn philosophical pretty quickly. That is true. So that's an interesting question. I like that question. In terms of this case, first of all, I want to say that I always try to wait till the end. So one thing I would define reasonable doubt is what you have after you've heard all of the evidence and you haven't made a decision too early. So reasonable doubt is something that you wait to find out about. I always find that to be really a hard thing because in my mind, any doubt is always reasonable. If I have a doubt, then I must be being reasonable. And I don't think that's exactly there. So you ask, how do I personally do it? That's kind of my thought is, well, if I'm still doubting, then that must be reasonable. It's not that. That's not the standard, as you know. And the prosecutor will tell everybody reasonable doubt isn't any doubt. It isn't that last niggling little question you have. It's reasonable. Like you've considered it. And now that's really not reasonable. So I'm not going to count that. And he'll push them on that. And rightly so. That is the standard. Okay. So let me, where was I? It was CBC. Oh, there we go. Cromley Luxury. Good to have you in again. And thank you very much. And Lori Startazer, I appreciate the super sticker. And let's see, Lisa, thank you. I appreciate that. Lisa Morehouse. All right. So P Doggy is asking an interesting question. You mentioned the controversy over the cartridge ID process and if it's valid. And could you talk about the evidence or testimony about that controversy? So we've only had one ballistics witness so far. The ballistics witness for the state said she did not say it was a fingerprint, but she said that in her experience and with her training, she was able to tell that this cartridge came from that gun. And having used her interpretation and looking at it holistically and using all her background and experience, she didn't want the jury to run off, just do pictures. That wasn't good enough. She had to look at all of it. But after she looked at all of it, the cartridge matched Richard Allen's gun. Well, a lot of people think that doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's not just pretend. There are actual studies and documentation and groups who oppose the use of that sort of ballistics matching, especially in criminal cases, because they think it's not realistic that these are machine-made parts, that you don't get a whole lot of individual variations, and that there's not long-term testing where many guns were fired and many guns were compared, thousands perhaps, to prove that really this could be individually matched back. So there were two witnesses the defense wanted to respond on this. One witness is still going to appear, and that witness is going to say, you say these bullets match up, or the cartridge matches the gun, but you're wrong. And if you look at it right, you're just wrong. On the other hand, the other witness, a metallurgist, was going to testify about the fact that he doesn't believe this can be done. He doesn't believe the gun can match to the cartridge. It's just, that's fake science, junk science it's called. Now, this witness is a metallurgist, but the judge said, you're not offering him on metallurgy. You're offering him on this other issue. You're offering him on this question, and he doesn't have the expertise, and I'm not going to allow him to testify about that but I will declare him an expert in metallurgy, but you aren't offering him for that, so I'm going to exclude him. So that's how the ruling went. Wild and Free Neurodiversity is a new member. Welcome. Cross, as Trina Sloan says, is giving great foresight into the defense argument. Yes, indeed, it really is. And Shan Gold is a new member. All right. Well, I think we will call it a night. We've had a long night. It was just quite the day, and tomorrow should be just as exciting because I believe we're going to have Dr. Walla, and I think she will be testifying. We might have the confessions made to Richard Allen's mother and grandmother. I think we are on the cusp of switching between the prosecution case and the defense case. Don't know exactly when. The judge called the lawyers up there and talked and then thanked them afterwards for having helped her clear up kind of where things would be going, but she didn't tell us. So I can't say for sure what will be happening next, but I think we might be about to do the switchover, which could mean we're headed for an even faster end of the trial than we were expecting. November 15th is how long the judge had allotted for this. So we still have some time left on that. We will see. All right. Well, I'm trying. Oh, I haven't thanked Susan and Brad from last night. I'm sorry about that. They drove in for 2 hours, maybe it was even 3, and waited all night. I cannot thank you enough for that, in line for me. And honestly, I couldn't do that if it weren't for y'all helping and supporting. And I'm so, so grateful to all of you who have done that. So thank you so much. All right. And I will see you all in tomorrow night's video. Don't know, will it be 7? I'll go as soon as I can after I get home from court and try to get my notes together. See you then.